on YouTube. Okay.
Okay.
You're not on right now. Your picture's not on, but if you want to start video, click that icon.
Welcome, everyone, to our tonight.
What icon?
We are hosting us at Zindzi Airlines as part of our Everyday Futures class, which is a month-long series of events that we do every April. There is an event happening almost every single day this month, so please look at our website, everydayfutures.org, for more information about that. I'm Sam, I'm one of the co-directors here, and I'm going to introduce all of our wonderful panelists. So Talilnh Agoyo, she, her, is co-founder and director of We Are the Seeds, a nonprofit organization amplifying Indigenous voices through the arts, as well as an artist, mother, and podcast host. She has worked in film and television for more than 30 years. Her own artwork is focused on capturing the vibrancy of Indigenous peoples today, including the Warrior Project, a collection of photos of Native youth, and their continuing commitment to environmental stewardship. Gigi McGraw is a social practice artist, actress, and writer. She earned her master's degree in theater from Villanova University. Gigi is fascinated with the life stories of individuals. She is also an advocate for hyper-local history projects, documenting life through recorded testimony, exhibits, print, and creative missions locally and abroad. Morgan Lloyd is a gallery guide at African American Museum of Philadelphia, and so you say AMP, an educator at Agnes Irwin Upper School. Working alongside the programming team at AMP, she oversees AMP's docent, I always misconnect docent for and provides interpretive tours. Additionally, she is currently an Andrew W. Mellon Territorial Fellow at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, working with territorial initiatives to uplift local Black and local Indigenous narratives in early American galleries. Zindzi Harley is an assistant curator at the AMP and an alumni of the University of the Arts, where she completed an MA in Museum Studies. She is also a project curator of past present projects. Her research focuses on the histories of Black museums and how we can learn from these founding museums to leverage institutional structures that advocate for the preservation of cultural heritage of the African diaspora. And then our wonderful moderator, David Acosta, is a writer, poet, cultural worker, and co-founder of Casa de Duende, along with his life partner, Jerry McDonald. He has served on a wide range of committees and boards, including past work with the Philadelphia International Film Festival, the Philadelphia Gay and Lesbian Film Festival, the PA Council on the Arts, as well as a founding member of Our Living Legacy, the nation's first festival devoted to art and AIDS. In 1993, he served on the East Market Street Sculptural Review Committee, which selected artist Raymond Sandoval, Tiananmen sculpture from among more than 3,000 artist proposals. He was a founding member of the Latin American Writers Collective, as well as the
from the other side, it's a journal.
He is also a co-founder of the Philadelphia Working Fund for Artists with HIV and AIDS. He's also the president of the Sierra Alliance board. So Gigi here for everything you get.
And welcome everyone. This is welcome everyone, and thank you to the panelists and the viewing audience on this panel. And I'm trying to dive in and talk about some of these issues because I think they are, they're present now in a lot of discussions that are happening across the country. So I wrote some notes, and then I'm gonna kind of look at my notes, and that way I stay on time and on topic. So I want to first and foremost acknowledge the land that we are on. So greetings from Turtle Island, the land of Valeri, known as the Navajo. We must acknowledge that we are on stolen land. I make no ifs or buts about that. And that the people that lived in this area were forced off the land through what became known as the Trail of Tears. And I actually had the great privilege when I was very young of meeting Nora Thompson, who was kind of one of the last survivors of. She was a small baby when her family was forced to relocate to Oklahoma through the Trail of Tears, and so want to acknowledge that same process was repeated throughout Turtle Island, throughout Native America, and so the displacement of indigenous peoples, we must acknowledge that. We must also acknowledge the history of chattel slavery, whose staff, of course, caused the displacement. That the bringing of enslaved individuals, and I'd say enslaved, not slave, because there's a difference in the terminology. And part of one of the things that we talk about decolonization is we must decolonize our own use of language. We must be cognizant and conscious of addressing people through how they want to be called, how they want to be referred to, and that includes gender. But certainly, I think, and so I think that we cannot, ignore the fact that the success of this country and this nation, is in great part due to the labor of enslaved Black people. And I think if anyone has not looked at the 1619 project done by the brilliant Nicole Sheridan, I dove into it when she first published it, and it's really amazing. And if folks haven't, go to the New York Times or type in 1619 project, and it really does have some really wonderful essays by some really top-notch scholars that talk about the different things that are now obviously coming to the forefront in critical race theory. And sadly, sadly also that, even before the transatlantic slave trade, that, brought enslaved people from Africa to the Americas. Slavery was already well established among the Spanish colonies. They were called encomiendas, which meant in charge of, and basically indigenous people were allotted land, and the land they lived on, including the individuals, to people designated by the crown to be, basically their owners. And of course that they were exploited and disposed of as property. And then we want to talk about, rape and all of the other things that are part of, the history of this nation and other nations as well. And so we get to this question, I think, about where we are currently. And I wanted to say, I mentioned critical race theory, and I guess folks are pretty familiar with critical race theory. I guess folks are pretty. And I picked up a little snippet from the web, just so that we all have kind of a basic understanding of what it is. And so it's the core idea that race is a social construct, and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policies. And this is where intersectionality comes into place, and that where there are systems, right after the Civil War, there were systems put in place, redlining, all of those things, the industrial prison complex, all of those things are things that actually work to keep people from achieving. And so I wanted to, I guess, put a question out to the group. How do we as Indigenous and Black artists and curators use these opportunities for questioning and in many ways rectifying what has been determined to be the official story? And I wanted to, the current exhibition at the Barnes, Water, Wind, Breath, which was curated, and I've not been, but I've been following them and reading about it, and I thought that these folks actually did a pretty good job in terms of, I think, at least acknowledging. So the exhibition takes, Alfred Barnes' collection of Indigenous art and places it alongside contemporary living artists, Native American artists. And so these artifacts are not seen as, just past artifacts or as artifacts of past, peoples or obviously they're historical in nature, but they're placed in the context of modern contemporary practicing artists who are in many ways keeping those traditions alive and working through them and working with them and creating them anew in different ways. And so I wanted to ask about that. And the other one thing was that they actually invited a curator, a Native American curator. And he isn't an assistant curator. He is a curator alongside the other two. I think one is from the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the other one is from the Barnes. And then I got his name here. Tony Chavarria, yeah, from Santa Clara Pueblo. And so he's not an assistant curator or an associate curator. He is a curator, and that I think is really important. So I wanted to put that out there, and wanted to, maybe start off with Talilnh, because you went to the exhibition, right? You did. What did you think of the exhibition, how it was handled? I think, and so part of it is that I wanted to discuss was, not only how the exhibition was conceived and executed, but also the signage, which is really important and critical. And, as curators, we have to be very aware of what we're transmitting to the viewer, but also how we're presenting the object itself.
Right. Well, I'm glad that the exhibition is finally here. I know that it's been a long time coming, that there was the collection downstairs of Dr. Barnes, what he collected when he was in New Mexico, but there wasn't much knowledge, I guess, in the institution about the pieces. And so I was really happy to see them bring in Tony to talk about the work and place it alongside contemporary Native artists. We Are the Seeds have been in and out of that conversation for a long time, and then and at one point it evolved, right? And then the pandemic and then shutdowns, and then we were out of the conversation. And I know that they were working with Tony and some other artists from other areas, not from the Northeast, from the Southwest and from Plains. And so I thought the exhibition itself was powerful. I thought it was really wonderful that they had the traditional and contemporary alongside each other with those descriptions. But like with any curated space, there were things that stood out to me, especially with the writing. There was one when you entered in and he was talking about dancing. I was wondering who wrote that. It was talking about dancing as like the performers, and I'm like, that they were not. We're not always doing everything for the white gaze. Like they were not performers. They were dancing for themselves, and maybe you happened to be there. Maybe Dr. Barnes happened to be there.
Right.
Little things like that I just and the way it was written, like very new agey and kind of like the vibration and meeting heaven and earth. And I don't know who wrote it, and I don't. But that was something that really stood out to me. Like, oh, this is really feeding into that kind of stereotype.
Right.
I mean, overall, I want to be very positive about it, and I'm really thankful that they did bring in Tony and some other people, and most of the contemporary artists that are part of that I've worked with them for several years. I know most of the artists that are part of, who have been coming in. And that's been really wonderful to see more Native representation in Philadelphia and see like people that I've worked with in Santa Fe when I used to work there, being here in town, and it's been really great. My only thing is that I recognize that Dr. Barnes collected Southwest Native art because of his life, and his wife was in New Mexico because she was not well, and that's why he was collecting the work there. I really had wished that there was some representation of Northeast Indigenous artists because we are here. We are here, and this is something that, you know, maybe they didn't quite fit into that exhibition, but there has to be, I thought there could have been a way to incorporate folks that like live down the street or in New York or up north, because there is a consistent blind spot regarding Northeast Indigenous artists. It's constant, and especially urban Native artists. And too often I've seen growing up in New York and seeing like there are phenomenal artists here on this coast, but institutions will spend their money and their budgets and fly bunches of people in from other places and show them a good time. Everybody's like all excited about it, and the person down the street trying to make the same living, you know, representing the East Coast, which is so underrepresented, doesn't get the call. So I have mixed emotions about a lot of it, but I'll wrap up. But that being said, they did invite Me Are the Seeds to, we were there last week or 2 weeks ago to do one of the family days. And we represented, and so we had Yuri Ridgway and the Red Blanket Singers, who are Lanai Lenape, incredible dance, culture bearers group, just really sharing who they are in Southern Jersey, sharing who they are, sharing how they're carrying on traditions, and who Native people are today here in this area. And Avery and Maya did a lacrosse presentation, and Shin did a storytelling presentation. So we were there representing. So, and I appreciate James Claiborne for bringing us in to do that, because I think he really recognized that we did need that type of representation.
Yeah, James is pretty cool.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
He
it was
gets,
wonderful.
James gets it, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
He definitely gets it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a very weird question you're asking.
No, I felt like all of the points you made are so valid. I think that in a lot of museums, because they are institutions at the end of the day, we're still so based in like this formal manner of going about creating exhibitions, making space. And I think it's very scary for these institutions as well to like take that step to start discussing something that's been so oppressed. And hidden away deep down in these collections or, you know, these other spaces. And I think that even though it's scary work, we should continue to try to do that. And I think that we also assume that there's some threshold that you meet when it comes to how many experts or people from a certain identity that can come in the room and, you know, create that narrative. But there really isn't. There's so many different sides to the story of, you know, an individual or even a community at the end of the day. And I think, you know, we tend to see like a lot of cultures and different identities turned into these monoliths within these spaces, as opposed to saying, oh no, like, yeah, this person did have this experience, or this was definitely a facet of the story, but there's so many facets that have come together to create an even more visceral experience for people that are coming to see these exhibitions. So I think, yeah, it's definitely scary work, and I love to see people do that work. I think it's more at this point like mitigating harm. You know, it's like you have these experts coming in trying to figure out how can we be the least harmful, but it's like, you know, maybe we need to pivot and start thinking, how can I be even more uplifting and empowering, as opposed to how can I be less problematic? And a lot of institutions don't want to be canceled, and it happens. But it's a hard conversation to have, but at the end of the day, I would hate to go into an exhibition as a Black woman and see myself, see an institution thinking they're uplifting me and my people, and then it's like such a limited, you know, viewpoint. It's only a slice of the pie. Like, we're not all having the same experiences every single day. Certain things are definitely communal, but I think we just need to be more proactive in general about acknowledging that, you know, variability within anything that you're doing or anything that you're expressing to the public. And then thinking like, am I truly taking the time to interpret this in a way that is, like I said before, empowering as opposed to just comprehensive or textbook. And yeah, labels and signage are definitely a big thing, but also, you know, those are conversations we need to be looking at as a whole with like accessibility, as opposed to just looking at the scholarship of what we're writing down and naming things. But we need to look at like, how is this language accessible for somebody who may have participated in this or is a bearer of this artifact or this history, as opposed to just like, how can I explain this in the most educational way possible? Because the terminology, the nomenclature, all of it gets mixed up, and it can be hard to wade through that as a viewer. And if you're not somebody that comes from, you know, an institution, then it can be very confusing. And I think people can walk out with the wrong experience as opposed to being enlightened to a certain degree. So
To kind of bump off of you, when I think of interpretation as well, what I wish institutions did, it's rather than being reactionary, to consider the people on which whose land they stand. I don't just mean exclusively Indigenous voices, they need to be included. We're in the city of Philadelphia, this is one of the oldest Black populations in the nation.
Yes.
And most people who have been here for centuries have no idea that they have been here for centuries and how big of an impact they've had. And a little label can change a little Black or brown person's life. So we consider interpretation for, let's say, Indigenous folks. When I look at the wampum belt as an Indigenous woman, that is like a very big deal to me because it reflects my ancestry. But when I walk past the wampum belt in the PMA, where do I see myself yet again? And then when I bring my little brother or sister, where do they see themselves again? A label, if I can point it out to them, can change their whole world. And especially for Black and brown folk as well, because frankly, with either Black or Indigenous people, oftentimes in textbooks, our history gets summed up with the word slavery, or our history gets summed up with disease or the word reservation. And to know that the world is more expansive and it continually is more expansive is deeply empowering. So again, rather than being reactionary, they need to consider the present and empowering, just feeling all of those things. And when they seek out different people and they consider the land on which we stand, how expansive have those narratives always been? And what can they do to bring those voices in? So when I see, let's say, the Lenni Lenape work, I see the land acknowledgement. People often don't discuss that the Nazi-Folk Lenni Lenape were a triracial group that did not walk the Trail of Tears that are still here. So that is a Black, Indigenous, and a multi-ethnic experience that is missing, that one label could change somebody's life. So yeah, echoing you 1,000 times, but just dropping a few more gems, I suppose.
To what you were talking about, I think it's very important that people's voices are heard authentically. There's a quote that I heard a couple of years ago, and I think it's so good that I write it down whenever I'm talking about something about preservation. And it says, at its best, historic preservation engages the past in a conversation with the present over a mutual concern for the future. And this is what William J. Martov, who was the first keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. So I think it's really important when you have these curated experiences that you also speak to the people who are, it's their life, it's their story, it's their voice, you know. And then when we're talking about cultural preservation, which is hand in hand with historic preservation, we look to the citizen historians, the people who live in the community, in the neighborhoods, you know, it's very important. And I think more institutions are starting to reach out. I know the New York Public Library, they have something about community memories that they're documenting, and more people are realizing that, hey, we don't know the whole story and let's not pretend like we know everything. Let's go to the source, let's talk to the people who could actually give us primary sources and information that we can use. And I hope that that's a trend that will continue because it's so important. In the hyperlocal stories, and I won't get off on a tangent about that, but what I'm interested in is preserving the stories of what they consider the disappearing neighborhoods, the invisible neighborhoods, that's not in the tourist book when you come to visit Philadelphia. You know, it's not the big streets, but it's an integral part of the fabric of Philadelphia in the story, and it should be preserved and told. So I'm glad that this is starting to happen and it's growing.
To kind of move off of you as well, considering all the big streets in the city of Philadelphia, thinking about how expansive those narratives have always been. When you look at Spruce Street, when you look at Walnut Street, when you look at Lombard, the Black elite in the 1800s lived there. It was predominantly white section of the city.
Mhm.
So where is that living?
The seventh ward, yes, yes,
Yes,
yes,
like
like all those stories.
But I remember many years ago that, we were, when they changed the Delaware Avenue to Christopher Columbus Boulevard. And I know that, for many indigenous people, that was a painful experience because it was an acknowledgement of the fact that, and you're right, that, not all the Lenape some have, but, some went as far as Canada. There are Lenapes in Canada because they were forced off their land. And so, and I think that that's one of the things that defines kind of our lives and our histories is resistance, right? We've always resisted, right? And I think that that's really important. I wanted to posit another question because I think that we've had the right after the George Floyd murder, assassination, everyone kind of had a reckoning. And, I received tons of letters and emails from cultural institutions all over the country, kind of acknowledging the mea culpa around the fact that, we need to acknowledge, and that's when people started, naming the lands, which really didn't happen much before then. That was when I think institutions are now starting to look at their collections and trying to figure out how they put those collections out there so that they can represent the communities in which they live, right, and thrive. And I think that that's the thing that, we have a different lens as people of color. We have a different lens. We see the world very differently than, say, non-whites than whites. We see it very differently because we're aware of kind of the historical processes that we still exist under. And so, so we have and after that there was the removal of the monuments, the Civil War monuments in the South, which were, we know they were historically placed to intimidate people, right? And then we've had in Philadelphia, obviously, the controversy with the Columbus statue over at Roosevelt Park, which is now encased in wood. In Puerto Rico, they toppled the Ponce de Leon statue during the visit of the Juan Carlos, the King of Spain. And so all of these things are happening. And so my question is that it's obvious that the ruling majority, those with power and access, have already established and perpetrated fictional narratives that purport to tell the official story, in quotes. What role can the artist and curator play in destabilizing, deconstructing, and reframing colonialist and imperative narratives in their work to counter what has been thought of and or is constructed as the official story? For example, that of discovery, we were discovered. That is so insulting, and so I guess how do we push back on and reframe those narratives in a way that, question museum curators, question signage, right?
Yeah.
How important that is.
I want to speak to that a little bit. And first of all, I think that you have to fight, we have to fight, or at the very least assert ourselves boldly to tell our stories. And sometimes we are the persons that we're looking for, the person that we want to stand up and say, hey, that's not right. Sometimes it just has to be you. It has to be grassroots level that you kind of take the helm and say, this isn't right. I remember years ago at the Franklin Institute, they had, I think it was an Egyptian, it was some kind of exhibit they had, and it was people that were protesting and saying, the narrative that you're putting out, the information you're putting out is not 100% accurate, and it was pushback so that they had to make changes, So I think the part of, you have these people who are PhDs and scholars or whatever, and, they're creating this narrative or whatever, but I think now with more people having access to social media, having the ability to do podcasts and do their own research, that's where we need to get more of the community involved and saying, okay, no, we're not gonna listen to you tell us the story, this is what it is, you know? So I think just knowing that sometimes it's okay to disrupt sort of the status quo, which always been established, and it's okay to do that. So that was just my little take on it, but I would love to hear what other people
No,
want
I
to say.
agree. I think it's very important to assert yourself and even better as a community because, you know, there's power in numbers, there's power in your voice. But I think we always discuss, you know, abolish the museum and like, let's just rebuild it again. But we know that, you know, these are things that are very difficult to actually put into play. And like I said before, because we are in these institutions, there's a formality to everything, the way that you go about doing this work that would be considered best practice. And that has continued to evolve over the years. And I think that's beautiful. And we're still we're wading through that. We're still figuring out, is best practice truly that? And are we acknowledging everybody in the room when we're discussing what that looks like? So I think some of it is definitely going to have to be us continuing to decolonize, you know, the way that we think, the way that we operate within these spaces. And I can honestly say that if there wasn't somebody in the museum at a high enough level questioning these best practices outside of all the clapback that you might get from visitors, then it's going to take a long time to see that change be made. So it really is about, I love that, you know, social media and all of these spaces are being the grounds for discussing what's going on, and even being used as a resource. But at the end of the day, you know, because it is an institution, we're going to put credibility and credentials always over, you know, what's going on on the outside. These museums were built like monuments as well to intimidate, and they have not always been very accepting of people of color, the people that they're collecting.
Right.
And it's gonna take people that do wanna go get a PhD and fight the system all the way through. It's not always going to be the community. We can have the community support us as well, because the institution is never going to completely die off. It was built, it was conceived out of, you know, the need to control, to assert power, you know,
Right.
from people that are more affluent or fit a certain identity. So I think some of it really is just more about, you know, taking the steps at a higher level. And I always advocate, I know a lot of people love curatorial work because of, you know, it's very romanticized and poetic that you're a curator and you put on this show and you brought all of these objects together to tell a narrative, but some of it is, some of the more activism that I'm seeing happen in these institutions is determining where the money's going, who's getting paid, who in development is determining who's coming in the door. So I think it's very important for us to also realize, you know, how we're gonna, the fight is in the institution doing what the institution does, and by you circumventing that essentially by, you know, getting through these loopholes, like, you know, they gotta have my master's, now I can work in a museum, or they gotta have my PhD, now I, as a person of color who would have probably gotten tripped over at the door so many times because of the gatekeeping that's happening within these institutions. Now I can make a difference because I've essentially snuck my way in through the means that you told me was, you know, more authentic, which is to have some sort of credential, which we're seeing less and less of that. I love seeing teaching artists and people that are really like based in the community have the experience, and we need those people. But in order to get somebody like that, and then you have to have some curator that probably, you know, had a very colonial experience in academia and scholarship to be like, oh, we need to bring this person into the community because I've seen where it's gone awry. I've seen how we've done these performative advances towards the community, like stating that we're on, you know, Native American land. I think it's beautiful, but I still cringe a little bit sometimes when I hear it. And, you know, even I catch myself up with like terminology and things, and I'm like, oh wow, I've really been thinking this way for so long. I took a course during graduate school called Decolonization in Art, and just reading through so much material about the way that we even go about collecting and going in the community and acquiring information from these people, and then don't even give it back to them for them to look over and be like, oh, you got it right. Like, it's more of just, it's like the museum's like some sort of succubus. We're just going out and like pulling from people, and we're not really engaging with them in the most authentic and genuine way.
And that's true of, I mean, that's true of medical research, that's true of sociological research. You know, you take and take, but you never give back, which could improve the lives of folks. Yeah, I don't know, Talilnh, you want to address that one question? Or?
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Susie and I were quite literally just talking about this on the way here. The hierarchy of education can be deeply frustrating and intimidating, especially when there are a lot of people who are actively doing the work on the ground and nobody is getting acknowledged. There are public historians who are existing despite the hierarchy of education, having panel talks, doing the work, and their community has no idea. Now, if the community doesn't see themselves reflected through, let's say, the curatorial practices of an institution, what are you doing to support your public historians so they can have a platform, because they have the voice that can get themselves there when nobody's listening to them. So with that being said, in addition to, let's say, seeking out 8 Lenape advisors for the PMA, and everybody supports the Lenape advisors, there's probably a Lenape person shouting from the rooftops right now that we are still here, this is important, and here's all the scholarship I've done and historical research I've done, because this is public information that I have access to, and they're not being supported. So if you aren't seeing people do the work up there, what are you doing to get our people up there, even if they can't have access to institutions, because that in of itself sometimes is a privilege, let alone if they want to be connected to it.
But I always look at museum staff and boards, and now most places have photographs, you know, and I'm always looking at to see, you know, who is in the decision-making power structure, you know, and just, you know, a quick glance tells me a lot about, you know, the museum and what it must be like for people that are not, you know, at this level working, trying to break those barriers of institutional, you know, tunnel vision that, you know.
I like Gigi's point that now there's an opportunity where we can build our own podcasts, and their social media is really effective in getting the word out for the things that are important to us. And so I know we're talking about institutions and how problematic that they can be, but I think we need to shift the discussion to like, let's not always look to the institutions to tell us what's going on, and let's look to the people, let's listen to the people, and like you mentioned that we're not all the same, right? So it's interesting when I have meetings with different institutions and they say, oh, well, we're talking to this one group or this one person, and you know, that they might be native, but they have one perspective, right? And there's like, how many more perspectives? And it feels like a lot of institutions get locked in, and that's like, well, we're talking to them, we've done our job, this is who we're working with, we're not gonna listen to anybody else. And that becomes a very big problem, especially when there's tension between certain native communities. And some.
And there are.
There definitely are, and
There are
I'm
lots
not
of
gonna bring them up
tensions.
here, but you know, when one native community says what our experience is the right one and you shouldn't listen to anybody else, that's not, and that's not okay. So yeah, but I think the point is that we need to move beyond looking to these institutions.
And can I just say, sorry, and that was one of the reasons why I said, listen, you know, I had tried to go the traditional route, and I was looking to get a property where, you know, and do everything that's by the books, and it wasn't working for me. And I said, you know what? I don't need permission from them, you know? So that's where I got the idea for POMON, which is the Philadelphia Online Museum of Neighborhoods. You know, that way I get to talk about those neighborhoods that are often overlooked, Black and brown communities in the city, pull out the history, interview the people, talk to the people who live there, speak to those hyper-local histories that would be lost if no one documented it. You know, because I said, you know, I don't have to get permission from an institution. You are respected, and I understand the scholarship that goes with it, and trust me, I'm going to many museums, but I also know that that doesn't dictate what my output will be and what I have to, say, okay, I can't do it, you know what I mean? And so that's what I was speaking to, yeah.
And to kind of go off of you as well, first and foremost, museums, I think, should not be the exclusive hierarchy of knowledge. One of my favorite things about working at AMP is we talk about the lives of Afro-descendant folks from 1776 to 1876. There's like 50 people on a wall that nobody's ever heard of. And the thing that makes it powerful isn't necessarily just the labels. It's the amazing docents and interpreters and guides, my local public historians, who are doing the work and making that story exciting and accessible to people. I have docents who are they create their own Black collective. I have docents with podcasts. I have docents who are digging through, finding the documents that Harriet Tubman signed with an X here in the city of Philadelphia, that if they weren't at AMP, would not have really, like, they have their own platform, but this is an institutional platform. I can go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art and I can shout from the rooftops, there was a Black man named James Ford who was in the top 3%, and George Washington hated him and he raided his house all the time. But they won't hear me because I don't have that traditional, let's say, academic background. And yet here's these public historians creating podcasts called Billy People Now Deceased, telling us why they're important. So what are we doing to make sure these people have space and that they are embraced and loved for all of the hard work and passion they have for it? Not just the knowledge, but the deep passion and connection to these individuals that are coming to life in the contemporary and within the past.
Yeah, I wanna yes, because into the back for folks who have questions, but I do have two other questions that, and I think, dovetails in some of your comments around, and so it's a question about how do we ensure historical continuity, right? When our own historical trajectories were interrupted. In most instances, willfully destroyed, misappropriated. We could not have created this. This happens, the mound builders of the Ohio Basin built some of the largest earthworks on earth. They're massive. Some of them are as big as the pyramids of Egypt. When they were discovered in the 19th century, they were, Egyptians must have come here. Or, I've heard everything from extraterrestrials. As if we didn't have the technology. And these sites are actually, astrological, map. I mean, they map the equinoxes and how people, and these were people that were, living in the United States, in the Ohio Valley. And so we could not have created that, right? And our cultures have been appropriated to enrich the cultures and histories of the colonizers, to romanticize notions of native peoples as noble savages, and of Black enslaved people as not human, right? And so how do we ensure a historical continuity? And then I will put one more question, which I want to especially three about, and that's Black churchalism, because I know that that's really a very important topic in the Black diaspora. And important because of the fact that, it's a very unique perspective that's not really found in other ethnic or racial cultures, this idea of the future being so important, right? And we know historically why it's important to discuss it. So how do we ensure historical continuity? And then I want to talk a little bit about, get your perspectives on Black futurism.
I think with the question of historical continuity, it's, I think this is why we very much so need to have somebody dropping the ladder down within the institution and having people climbing up as well from the grassroots level, because without it coming from both sides, you will get tripped up along the way. And especially with like education, because there is a hierarchy, and I hate to say it, about, museums being the authority on history and the authority on whatever objects and things that they're collecting. They're going to be the place that, educators within schools and these other institutions that we've been indoctrinated by, we all went to school. And if you don't go to school, there's an issue. There's an issue. The government will send a letter to your home and be like, why is your child not going to school? So we know children do need to be in schools, and in school, they're going to read textbooks that are informed by institutions like museums. So in my opinion, it's very hard for me to think about the way even Black culture specifically has been framed in our history with slavery, right? You read the textbook and it says you were a slave. You might go home and your parents are like, you were not a slave, you were brought here forcibly, and you know, this is really what the narrative is like. But other than that, if you go to school and you don't have that outside experience, you know, retelling you what really happened and reframing the way that you're thinking about yourself and what's going on around you, you're going to go with the story that you think has the most authority, which is coming from the textbook or the school or the teacher that's telling you that. So I think in order for us to make changes that will radiate on a larger scale throughout our community, you have to have a lot of it coming from the institution just as much as you have to have it on, you know, that grassroots level. And I think especially with cultures like African-American people and people from the diaspora, so much of our history has been considered invalid because we weren't writing it down. We were whispering to each other the truth about everything that was going on. And then we continued to do that throughout history. And that's the only reason we have some of these stories. And I'm sure it's the same for so many other cultures. I've heard this like funny quote about a woman when she's cooking, a Black woman, and she's like, I don't measure, I just hear my ancestors whisper over my shoulder how much to put in there until it's good to go. And I think it just speaks to the idea of griot and the idea of these public historians, you know, that are really doing that work, but we need somebody in the institution validating them as well so that, you know, it can climb up, we can climb up the ladder together, and soon we'll be populating the entire space in a way that's equitable, and we can interpret things on a way more equal scale than what we've been doing these days. And I think acknowledging, you know, a lot of those checks and balances is one of the things that's happening with the whole conversation on Afrofuturism. So I'm sure we'll get into that shortly.
Speaking about when you were talking about textbooks and what children are learning in schools, part of the reason why I chose to homeschool my son. So I pulled him out, I saw that he was going down a path that was not going to be pleasant. And so I took it upon myself to, you know, homeschool him. And everyone doesn't have the luxury to do that, and I understand that. But what I'm happy to say is that there's more people in the community that if they can't teach their children, they're finding other people. And it's almost like this communal system of, okay, this is what I can teach them. I can teach sewing, or I can do math, or I can do music, or whatever. And I think that kind of relates to what we're talking about even in the artistic realm, is that how can you have sort of this community aspect of telling your story and your history and also educating your children, you know, and sometimes you can counter that. Even if your child is going to a traditional brick and mortar school, what can you do when they come back home? You know, what can you do in the community? What can you do to kind of support that? So I just wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Kind of echo too, we think of the institution first, but if we want to change these narratives, there are everyday people who think it's standard. So one of my favorite things is that we're in the age of, age of access and the age of information. I can go onto one side of TikTok and I'm scrolling through a bunch of Black voices that are telling me 15,000 fun facts about Black history that I have never heard of in my school, at my job, that can enhance all of these things. I mean, the year of our Lord 2020 was a lot, but one of the blessings that came from it was that everybody has access to making their own panel discussion. Creating their own forum, making it accessible for other people. So lifting that work is a really big deal. And even if it's something that you've never heard of before, encouraging other people to jump in and just hear those different perspectives. It's a big deal. And then somebody walks away with new language they've never had before about these individuals, about their experiences. And it's easily accessible for folks, which is what I love. People are already intimidated by the museums. 99% of folks really don't walk into those institutions to read labels. Only a select few if you're a museum goer or just a scholar. But to be able to have access to it right there on your phone, it's a really big deal. So we need to be uplifting those folks who are doing that work a little bit more and making sure other people know they have the right to enter those spaces, even if it is just to be a viewer. You don't have to comment, but you're walking away realizing a more expansive view of somebody's individual experience. And again, log on to TikTok, log on to Instagram, go on to Facebook. There is a page that will teach you every question you have. And you can sound even more educated than some people who claim to have the language that's perfectly acceptable for these people that they are not interacting with.
Or even the free resource of the library, which I love, and the library card
Yes.
is worth, it's.
Invest.
Listen,
Letting go, yes.
There are community groups, there are organizations that have free events everywhere. You just have to go and look them up online on Eventbrite. I bet you there's 15 organizations of people of color or queer people or other intersectional groups that are trying to tell their story,
Right.
and they're only attracting their own. People need to know they have permission to walk into that room and learn.
Yeah.
Right, well, I think that's interesting, not just permission, but there has to be a way to encourage people to do that, right? Because it's the default that we're looking to the institutions for, or the kids in public school, and, you know, there's a certain type of education that people are exposed to. You really do have to do the work to step out of that. But one of the things that we were talking about, and like reaching out to these public historians or the people on the ground doing the work, it's really one of the core issues is funding, right? Institutions apply for these grants or they get these multi-year, multi-million-dollar grants, and they say, and part of the stipulation is, oh, you have to work with BIPOC communities, you have to be on the ground.
Right.
So they call up an institution like we are this week and say, hey, can you do this program, can you create this for us?
But no
And
money.
what, here's $1,000.
Right.
Meanwhile, they got $250,000 for the program, but that's keeping their lights on, paying for their staff, maybe for their gala, whatever it is, right? And that's really been frustrating for us because there are so many of us on the ground doing the work in community, understanding what's going on. And to have to work with that limited amount of funding,
Yeah.
I mean, that's really the bottom line.
That
Like,
is, yeah, that is a bottom
and
line.
it's there, and funders I know are shifting, which is really wonderful to see, they're starting to
They're
see a
starting
shift.
to get it, yeah.
But it's when an institution calls me and offers that, then you just can't do it, and you can't disrespect the artists you work with by saying, oh, well, it's, you know, whatever it is.
Yeah, I always try to pay artists because, you know, but it's not always feasible and possible, and you're right that, you know, it's almost exploitative when they ask you to come in.
It's like the taking
And
that you're saying,
there-
and it's a cycle of taking over and over again.
Right, and, you know, and the thing is too, that I think, you know, part of, I mean, you know, when I think of historical continuity, right, I think that my existence is resistance, right? That's a really powerful way of looking at it. And I, you know, and I know that at least, you know, through the Black diaspora and the, you know, there is, I mean, there are spirituals and there are songs and there's, you know, I was very interested in reading and following an artist who did a series of, I'm blanking out on her name, who did a series of installations in Atlanta. And this little wooden shacks that were called, I think they were called shaker houses. And they were like houses where people where enslaved people would go and sing and pray. And you know, the structures were so small and there were so many people that they actually shook. And I thought it was quite, she was just activating all of these things in really beautiful ways. So there is that level of resistance, and I know that, you know, when I travel through Latin America, I see resistance in the way indigenous people dress, you know, among the Maya and among the peoples of Mesoamerica, when their libraries and their codexes were burned by the Spanish and the church because they were, you know, things of evil, they transferred, you know, those codexes onto their clothing, which is why when you go to Guatemala, you see in Mexico, the Wilpe, you know, there are little trees and branches and birds, and there's all of this stuff going on. I am not privy to that culture, so I can't read it, but they within the culture can read it. And so, you know, they survived. There's a beautiful book that was done after the fall of the Aztec Empire called Vision of the Conquered. And it was, you know, there were people who were writing about what it was like to have lost their land, to have lost their civilization, to have lost their culture. So I think there is, you know, we are always in the process of historical continuity, you know, in really profound ways. And I think that the work that we're all doing is part of that work. And so I want to, I guess, move on to just this idea, because I think, you know, while it's important to I think the, you know, discussions for so this is a question. Can you talk about the idea of Black futurism? What is it, and its importance in the artistic and intellectual development of Black art and Black aesthetics? And how does Black futurism serve to challenge and reframe the narrative of the Black diaspora in the Americas? You know, and of course, the most famous and brilliant example is Black Panther, right? Which, you know, I mean, she spent 2 years doing research all over Africa to get this stuff right. But also this idea is not just important, I think, to the Black diaspora, it's important to indigenous people, to Native people. How do we imagine a future, right? Especially because of not only diminishing resources, but also what they've done to the environment. Which, you know, for Native peoples is, for most peoples, indigenous peoples, is sacred, and it's been desecrated, you know, so a little bit on that now.
I'm glad that you also like are mentioning indigeneity as well in this conversation, because I think it's really great to look at you know, some of the struggles that other, you know, cultures and communities are going through, and how we can bring those together to better analyze, you know, our own struggles or more individual struggles. And I think, you know, even with the conversation on decolonization, it's like looking at, you know, the experiences of the indigenous people. I think at the core is really where you can begin discussing, you know, even like the histories of slavery and the histories of Black and brown people that have been pushed to the margins. But in regards to Afrofuturism, I think it really, I don't want to call it radical, because I hate thinking that something that we haven't seen is so different or out there, but it is radical in the sense that it's imagining Black bodies in the future and us taking space and traversing, you know, the land that we're living on in a way that is, we're not in danger all the time, you know, and I think that that idea alone it is radical to an extent, because I definitely do think about the dangers of, you know, just being Black in America, and to imagine a world where, you know, you're taking up space and you're truly exhibiting, you know, something that's so core to your identity in a way is it's so empowering. So I think that's truly what Afrofuturism is being able to kind of break down a lot of those constructs that we've been living under, all people, you know, social, whether that's time or, you know, education in schools and things like that. It's like, how have all of these things that we've been working under, operating under as a society been oppressive, you know, specifically to people of the diaspora, and how they've been created to target those people specifically. So I think that's really what Afrofuturism is at the core. And there's some amazing artists that are out there really doing that work, like Black Quantum Futurism.
Right.
I worked with them during my time with Past Present Projects, and we did an exhibition at Strawberry Mansion, and the way that they just even looked at, you know, the way time really is such an oppressive factor in Black and brown people's lives, and how if we could collapse time in a way that we could really have a broader look at who we are, and a more comprehensive look that's actually true to our own experiences, as opposed to what, you know, the institutions are telling us, or those people that have continuously tried to keep us out of the conversation. So yeah, I would say like we're seeing a lot of amazing work from people, whether that's like in contemporary art or practitioners, because even Black Quantum Futurism, they're both housing attorneys, and they both really work. One of the artists was a housing attorney, and they work deeply in the community to stop things like, you know, unfair housing, which is really a big issue for Black and brown people. So their practice is so hand in hand with the actual activism and work that they're doing in the community.
The thing about what you said, when you're saying radical, it is radical, but mainly it's decolonial. Removing those colonial structures that oppressed us all for so long. I was watching, I think it was a TED Talk the other night, where it was a teacher who focused exclusively on Afrofuturism, and she had a group of 10 kids, I think they were all around the 5th grade, and asked them, what did the future look like for you? And 99% of their written responses in one paragraph was like, a world with no guns. A world where my parents can both have a job. And then she challenged them again. Okay, so let's imagine that we don't have guns anymore. And let's imagine that your parents were allowed to get a job. What would the world look like? They're like, well, I wish I had a house. All right, so let's imagine you had the right to have a house. What would the world look like? And then that's when they began to have infinite imagined dreams. Bigger visions beyond the immediate. That's when you start seeing them having sports cars, or beyond that, I'm creating spaceships. I have the right to do what I want to do. And so it's deeply decolonial because you're teaching people as they are growing into the future and currently imagining the future that it is possible to do this. So it's important to embrace these topics. And also, as we are embracing Afrofuturism, it's a big, representation is deeply important as well. When I walk with students, sometimes when I talk about Afrofuturism, I'm like, okay, so tell me something, or like, tell me about a movie or show that had this theme. Number one answer is Black Panther. I'm like, okay, well, what other movies did you see Black people in space? Guardians of the Galaxy, Zoe Saldana was green though. Right, why wasn't she Black? Why wasn't she Latinx? And what can we do to make sure the next movie that comes out, they have the right to do this? It's a really, really big deal. It's fun watching kids have these infinite imagined futures, and us now as the people taking up space, we need to make sure they know they have that right and allow ourselves the right to imagine our people in infinite imagined futures so that they can continue to dream. As we are here doing this groundwork, making sure that our communities are being taken care of and protected and treated as the sovereign communities that we all are, making sure the kids understand as well. So as we move forward in this, just a thought.
That's great. I'd like to speak to that too, with the whole Afrofuturism. So the seeds were planted a while ago. So I know that there is a tree that you plant the seed and it takes maybe 50 to 60 years for it to actually start to push through the dirt, right? And then it starts to grow, right? But you have to count all the time that it was under the ground as well. And I kind of think that's what's going on with Afrofuturism. So I'm going to take it back to the 1970s with Parliament Funkadelic, right? And that was Afrofuturism. And anybody who was a Funketeer know that, the spaceship will come down, the mothership will come down, it will free your mind, your backside will follow, so all of that was planting the seeds, and I think where we are now is in the bloom of that, you know what I mean? Because I think that it took a hold back in the 70s and the early 80s when that was going on, is because it gave people a sense of, I can be liberated from this oppression, right? This is a place where I can belong. My face will be in the future. I can be part of the future. So I just wanted to say with the whole Afrofuturism, when people talk about Black Panther, that's great, but I want to take it back, 50 years ago,
To chime off with you, when I first started learning about Afrofuturism, because one has to live at some point. I wasn't always working in this field. When I first started reading and watching literature, a lot of people attribute Harriet Tubman as the first Afrofuturist. She is the person who is taking people, bringing them into these northern cities, ideally to Canada, which was the Mecca, and daring them to dream their most infinite imagined futures.
That's really interesting.
To recall on the ancestors that they have been doing this work. And now it's our turn to make sure that we can vision even further. Who knew if Harriet Tubman imagined Black people in space?
Right.
But we know.
She doesn't have a vision.
Right.
And we have, and we're lucky to have, we have, two, Butler and Martin Delaney, who actually lives in Philly, who lives not too far from here. Both African American, queer, who are some of the best science fiction writers, not only in the United States, but in the world. And there is a really interesting essay that it was a question that was posited to Martin Delaney by someone who says, why aren't more Black people writing science fiction? And so there's this really fascinating conversation, this interview that's done of Martin Delaney around kind of unpacking all of that. And I think folks should look it up and do that and download it, because it's really fascinating. It's not too long, it's about 20 pages, but it's a really nice. Talilnh, do you want to close us off with this idea of how do I guess, this concept of the future, right? How do we, how do indigenous people, at least, at least in North America, right? Because I think what's really interesting is that the encounter between the folks in indigenous peoples in other parts of the Americas was very different than the encounter that happened between, the English colonizers and it was only when Western expansion began that things really got crazy and so, Native American people exist as sovereign nations, right? They have reservations, right? There are places that they own and they have their own tribal governance, right? So it's a really complicated relationship between them and the outside world and even, the official government. And so, so how do you see that? How do you see this idea of a future playing for indigenous people?
What did you mean by, you were saying the coastal people had a different relationship to the settlers?
No, I meant that the way that colonization happened in the Americas, in Central and South America and the Caribbean was very different.
Oh, I see.
Because they were there for gold, and so the brutality of it was insane. I think, the Wampum Belt, Penn made a treaty with, the native peoples here, as happened with other parts, in other parts of at least, the northeastern seaboard. But they thought they were dealing with other nations, right? And so that creates, I think,
I mean, there was so much destruction here.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that, and I don't know, I think the Penn Treaty, it wasn't that disputed, that
Yeah.
treaty is not necessarily.
Right.
That was fraudulent, wasn't it?
Mhm.
And so, and then the, up in the Northeast, there were the Pequot Wars, I mean, people were decimated.
there's-
I mean, there are millions of people living here
Right.
in North America decimated.
Mhm.
Right, so, in terms of the future, I always. It's interesting to always talk about resistance and talk about survival, but what we're seeing now is Native people are thriving and we're making space for ourselves, right? And I love what you were saying about, even talking about social media, and sometimes people are very dismissive of that. Like on TikTok, there's native TikTok, right?
Exactly.
And that's powerful,
Yeah.
even if it's jokes, right? It's like, we get them and they're for us, and
Right.
people can share and understand it. And there was this whole drama on TikTok that happened recently,
Yes.
but everybody was chiming in on it, and everybody was learning about Native people in that way.
Right.
Not to get on tangent on TikTok, but they're talking, like the social media or the internet is generally not, we're thinking about it as like more of the great equalizer, right? Whereas, I mean, obviously, there's still some very remote areas who don't have access, and that's still an issue that we need to contend with. But it's having us make space for ourselves, right? Where people were not passing the mic before or stepping
Right.
aside. And we're taking it. And
I mean, that's
with or without funding, we're gonna make it happen
Right.
because we have to.
Yeah,
This is all of our, and what you said, David, about the Black and brown experience, like, this is who we are. To exist in this world, we live in a different way. When we wake up in the morning, even as children, for better or worse, we're representing, right? We're representing every time something comes out of our mouth, every time someone asks us a question or how to pronounce my name, like, there's this huge responsibility that comes with being a person with a global majority, right? You're always being like, you're always representing, and you're always fighting for something. And that's not always sometimes you're tired, and like, that's not something that I asked for, but it's the reality. But we're making space,
Right.
and we see the shift. I mean, even in the past 10 years, we've seen a huge shift.
Yeah, I mean, I think the shift in the visibility of Native people is really pretty intense. I mean, I follow all of, and the models now that are, for the first time, really like, indigenous models are, Native American models are like at the top of and so it's wonderful too. I guess I wanted to,
Can I just say something really
yeah,
quick?
and then we can move on to questions.
Yeah,
From the
when we
audience.
think of the future, obviously, infinite imagine futures, but to echo you as well, the future is now. We are currently somebody's wildest dream.
Right,
When I think of my grandmother who came here during the Great Migration, me existing in the space that I am right now is not something she could have fathomed. So we need to take ownership of where we are. When I think of my grandfather on my other side of the family, I mean, I'm a reclaiming native. It was illegal to be native until 1970. So this is somebody's envision right now. So us taking ownership and not just surviving, but thriving
And
and
celebrating that.
Exactly, embracing people within our communities, not just to say an indigeneity. There's a little Black girl somewhere in Ohio who's the only Black girl in her town who does not know it's time to be proud to be radically Black. And us doing this work right now, showing this, talking about this, it's bringing us closer to the future that we are already infinitely imagining.
Right.
And that's the point I wanted to bring.
yeah, thank you. So anyway, close up questions or?
I have a couple in chat.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so Joanne, you felt made a really good point too, going off of what you were talking about, Morgan. Is also interviewing artists and having that publicly accessible, which I think again, like Zoom and all of these tools that are available to us now that we really weren't using in art spaces to the extent that we are now. It's like we're like this, we're YouTube live streaming this right now, so this is accessible on YouTube in 10 minutes after we end the meeting, and we had a panel discussion for the exhibition that was sitting in the other day on Saturday. And like two of the artists that we were talking to were Nadina and Nancy on this wall, and they were talking, they're both Indigenous artists, and they were talking about like the use of color in their work. And like Nadina was making really incredible points that I hadn't thought about when I looked at her work about the use of color as like a language. And like when she went into like white institutional educational spaces, like they were trying to get her to tone down the color she was using. And she's like, no, because like within my culture, like this is a language and this is the point that I'm trying to make with using this saturated red or this saturated green. And like, I would have had no idea any of that within her work if I didn't attend that panel discussion on Saturday, So I think like actually discussing this with the artists is so important and like the documentation of it, so like it is available. So thank you, Joanne, for that point, and Morgan for that point. But here's a question that Kit Donnelly posted to the chat, which is, I would love to hear you all speak about what happened at the VMA. The museum guards who were allowed to curate an exhibit. It is so obvious that throughout history, guards at museums are people of color, and of course, the rest of the institution is primarily white or entirely white. Is this a breakthrough, even if small?
If I could jump in on this, Philadelphia Museum of Art, I think they have some of the best guards I've ever met in my life. They had a show recently at Philly New Grit. And when I walked through that exhibition time and time again, because it was uplifting contemporary artists, mainly artists of color or artists who were queer and or lived somewhere in those intersections, the guards were my favorite interpreters. My favorite one exclusively, there was a artist, he's white, and he created an entire room that revolved around the themes of diabetes. And he made literally 3D skulls or 3D models of his skull, and he made a fountain that had floating chocolates that were the perforations that come when diabetics take their insulin shots. And I learned about it because I met the artist, but the security guard who was standing next to it was so passionate about this topic. One, because he was an artist, and two, because he was just deeply passionate about it to such a degree that when the show was closing, the artist actually came in, let him give a discussion, like let the security guard have the floor, and then bestowed him actual chocolates of the diabetic chocolates he made. So to see that exist and know that they're being seen and heard is beautiful. And not just seen and heard by, let's say, the people who are walking the floor because they're visitors, or somebody like me who knows the security guard has a favorite piece of art and he dreams of being an artist one day, but the people on the top are listening to it.
And I like to speak to that too. So when I was in undergrad, my summers I worked as a security guard at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So I really think it's wonderful that they're saying, hey, let's have the guards and the people who are securing this artwork kind of talk about, what they've learned. One of the things is when you're in the different exhibits, you are soaking up all the information, you're reading all the information, and then if you have an art background yourself, you're bringing your own expertise to that. So a lot of times I feel some of the security guards are more informed than the actual person who's doing the tour, and then they also have, they're going to each and every exhibit and they're even looking at people's responses.
Right.
And I remember sometimes it might not even be about the art, but it might be about the people's response to that art. And they might say, hey, that picture over there, when people look at that, they do two things. One, they kind of step back and then they look around, so all of that is kind of feeding into the experience. And it makes it more of an enriching sort of like experience. And so
The security guards are secretly docents, like they're secretly the interpreters, and nobody ever talks about that.
Especially because they're within earshot when folks are giving
Right.
tours.
Right.
So they
Yes,
learn
Yeah.
from the
I did.
the tour guides.
All day long.
And
All day long, yeah.
even for those who aren't art people, because a lot of security guards just so happen to be art people or independent scholars, and this is their way in to learn. It's cool to hear the folks that don't necessarily care about these things, because now you have a more accessible interpretation. One of my favorite security guards, I asked him what's his favorite word, he's like, that one because it's yellow. And that is the best thing I've ever heard, because he's going to talk to somebody later today and they're both going to contemplate how great that color yellow is. And now that visitor feels empowered that they have a good interpretation. So it's great to see it happening somewhere.
No, I also agree. Formerly worked at the PMA and was enlightened by the security guards so many times because they really engage with the space in a totally different way. And if you have to sit in the room with a piece of art every day for its run in a show, how many ways could you think about that in a 3-month period? So it's really amazing seeing them get to take that opportunity. And it's amazing seeing the staff who normally would curate this work, letting go and seeing how that plays out and seeing that, okay, this can be something positive and now it's possible to sustain something like this in the future and to continue to bring people in on that level. And it creates a newfound respect as well when it just comes to the work culture and the hierarchy within the institution, because we all know these frontline workers are the last people that they're thinking about in these museums. And they're also, they're oftentimes the person that's in some of the most danger. A security guard, that seems like at a high profile museum as well, that seems pretty scary, people are interested in the art in that type of way. And I think that even with what we saw happen at MoMA with their frontline staff getting attacked and things like that, we're just living in a different time, and people are going through so much as well right now and are so kind of at a disadvantage, and then they come into these spaces and you can be triggered by art sometimes. And I think we should start showing that we care more by letting these people have a say, and showing them that the way they engage with art is just as valid as the curator or the executive director, or whoever at the institution that they're working at.
Yeah, like the whole show, it was curated based on what the security guards thought was important, not just their favorite work of art, but sometimes security guards know the stories. Sometimes they know a bit more about the history, or they watch that artwork go from one wall to another wall, and they watch the hand fall off 5 times. Now people are deeply invested in it for another reason.
right.
I saw there's a chair, I think, in that exhibition, and they're like, well, why do you like the chair? Oh, because it fell 3 times. Like, it just adds to it. So it's just
Interpersonal connection.
Right.
And that's the thing that they're doing with hyperlocal stories and telling the stories of communities where they're having people become their own playwrights. So instead of having somebody come in and say, okay, I'm going to tell the story of your neighborhood, they're actually interviewing people and telling people about that. And that's really exciting to see. So it's kind of connected in that.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I have one more question in the chat, and then if anyone has a question in the audience. So Peggy Fontenot asked, how are your curators handling the issue of federal tribes working to eliminate state recognized tribal artists and those that are certified from exhibiting at shows?
Good question.
Yeah, I did not know about that, so I'm really curious about that.
Everybody's looking at me, Peggy. Peggy knows my answer. I think that she wants to know the answer because you're in the
Well,
institutions.
So, yeah, I think it is interesting. I posted and I'll give an example. I posted on my Instagram a quote by this contemporary artist who died actually a few weeks ago. Let me find this quote. His name is Jimmy Durham, and Jimmy was involved in a lot of controversy because he claimed he was Cherokee, and the Cherokee Nation didn't have his records that that he was Cherokee. Eventually, he stopped claiming he was Cherokee, but he had really amazing insights. If you can find a lot of his quotes from how he wrote and what he wrote during that time. And and so I guess one of the questions is, and I was also listening to a curator at a museum that had been asked to curate a series of Lakota paintings that are sacred paintings, and they're part of and so this idea of who is registered, right, in terms of recognition. And so there are some artists, and it's a problematic issue because I'm very careful not to say I'm Native American, right? Because that implies a very different thing. I can say I'm indigenous because I have tons of indigenous ancestry, right? But I'm very careful because it means something different to, in terms of, Native American people, they have, that's what I was talking about a little bit earlier, is that, they are recognized as sovereign nations, right? And their dealings with governments are different. And so, so the question I think might be that how do folks, or how do curators deal with artists that claim to be indigenous or claim to be Native American, but are not recognized by the.
So
the
is that what
governments.
Peggy,
The tribal
Peggy is
governments.
asking how do the curators handle that situation?
The exact question was, how are your curators handling the issue of federal tribes working to eliminate state recognized tribal artists and those that are certified from exhibiting at shows?
Right, yeah.
And Peggy also apologized for putting you on the spot.
Oh, no, she didn't put me on the spot, because I'm not a curator, so.
I can only echo a little bit, again, with the work that I'm trying to do with the PMA, I'm the only person kind of advocating for Indigenous voices right now. When I look again at the Wampum Belt, I don't necessarily work with, I'm working or identifying 8 Lenape consultants, and I'm only doing this as well because 1, I descend from the Nazi cult, so that's a very unique experience. And then 2, there is an expansive experience of being Lanai Lenape. And I'm also a reclaiming native, so I can only say but so much because I am still learning to embrace culture, community, and kin relationships. So what I am trying to do at this time is to identify a contemporary, preferably Eastern Woodland, preferably Lenape, indigenous person who practices making wampum now in the traditional way as well as in the contemporary way, and giving them a platform to showcase 1, how beautiful this belt is on terms of how detailed and sacred the process is, but then also how Native folks are still alive and doing things as well. So I guess that is one way to try and include certain tribes. And then when it comes to AMP, mainly the things that I try to do with an interpretation is to uplift the Black and Indigenous narratives as well. So we have like Edmonia Lewis, who's a fantastic artist who existed back in the 1800s. And she was Chippewa and of Haitian descent, and nobody talks about how that intersectionality was kind of commonplace. And then also discussing how the Lanai Lenape people here were also multi-ethnic, and how there were Black Lanai Lenape people who were not included in the statements of all men created equal, and that Reverend Richard Allen, who created Mother Bethel AME Church, has an AME church down in Lenape land, down in the Dog Pound, down in Gould Town, and how that was good for Afro-Indigenous folks. So as we are updating our interpretation and giving people the floor, I'm trying to implement as much as I can, and that's as much as I can say for AMP and the PMA.
Yeah.
I guess now it's you.
I had a clarifying statement.
Peggy did?
Yeah. I'm talking about artists that are legal under the Indian Arts and
Right.
Crafts Act, but the federal tribes they're trying to say are not legitimate,
Right.
not those that are members of the tribe.
Okay, okay.
Got it.
Which
That
now I'm like, oh, I do know.
clarifies it a little bit.
Yes,
yeah.
thank you so much.
And David, you certainly talked about that a bit, that you identify as indigenous and you won't go down the road of saying specifically your native ancestry because it becomes problematic legally, which
Right.
is shameful, in my opinion. I mean, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act was created to protect Native artists from, Native art is $1 billion industry. There are fakes being made in all of,
Right.
in other countries. And it is a problem. But the issue is the Indian Arts and Crafts Act is now detrimental to actual Native people
Right,
and
right.
Native artists. And it will be a situation where they are seeking out Native artists and threatening them with fines or to put them in jail. And so there are a lot of Native artists who are either state recognized or not in a federally enrolled, or not card carrying or whatever you want to call it, who feel threatened and who feel like they're not allowed to claim who they are because of the law.
Right,
And so this is something that obviously museums have to abide by the law. And obviously we are the seeds and our organization has to work within the law as well, because I'm not going to jail. But, it's shameful and the actions of a lot of people who follow certain things, I think it is really unfortunate because we're intimidating a lot of artists from making art, and they're making art. They're not making millions of dollars. Like there are people who are doing way worse in the world.
Well, it's also a communication tool that is being kept from people too. Like if you're keeping people out of institutional spaces, it doesn't encourage them to learn those crafts. So like what Nadina was talking about with color and like David was talking about with like symbolism of clothing. Like, why are people going to continue those movements and like that artwork?
right. Then I was reading a really interesting article on Navajo weaving, and that's traditionally done. It's always been done by women, and there were two contemporary artists, both Navajo men, who were reclaiming. And I wasn't aware of this, but there had been a huge influence on traders and collectors during Orientalism, at the 19th century, that actually brought, Middle Eastern rugs and forced weavers, Navajo weavers, to weave rugs that had this kind of patterns in them. So those patterns actually influenced a little bit some of the weaving of the Navajo, after the encounter, or whatever we want to call that. And so the idea then was that these two artists were actually reclaiming and going back to before the coming of the whites, and looking at the geometric forms and the language of the landscape that was actually deeply, and animals that was deeply rooted in the geometric forms that were done in Navajo weaving. So it is, I think it is, it is problematic and sad that some artists are actually being excluded from that.
Or even not even allowed to say who they are,
Right, yeah.
Because they're for fear of their lives.
Right.
And, they're making art.
I have not heard about that.
And I think a lot of institutions and organizations don't actually understand the law
Right.
and abuse it. And so that's where we get into a lot of issues.
It just seems like another opportunity, for the man, and we all know who the man looks like and sounds like, to have a hand on, cultural production. It's like either you're scared, either you have to go through all of these checks and balances to prove who you are to make this art, which to an extent, I understand vetting people. That can be important because it can be problematic to have somebody, pulling a Rachel Dolezal on you, but at the same time,
Yes.
it's like, this is an industry, it has economic value, they see that, and they might not be able to get their hands on that money, so it's like, oh, let's see what we can do to play with that whole space, and it's like, it's unnecessary, obviously, but it's just it's one of those things that's so nuanced, like even with African art, we don't have any type of situation like that going, and African art is the most reproduce unauthentic, oftentimes in terms of it crossing water and coming to the US. And you see so many Africans honestly trying to make a living in Africa, mass producing things that would be considered ancient or authentic or true to whatever their cultural community is. And it's like, no, they're just doing this to survive at this point, but would they have to had you not come here and started extracting everything? But
And we didn't even, I mean, we didn't even talk about this issue of repatriation, right? Of artifacts that are in museums. Both, actual bodies, in drawers, and also, just artifacts, the Benin, now they're not going to be returned, but the LJ marbles, are a great example in London, so. So we didn't even touch on that, but I'm sorry.
Well, I was leading in kind of with what Zindzi was saying as well as what you were saying. When I think of, let's say, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, they have these beautiful things. They call them face vessels now. Their names have changed many times in history due to racial tension. But they were created by indigenous Africans who were brought here in South Carolina. And there are two different variations of it. There are those that were created in the late 1800s, where you can tell it is the ancestors creating these heads made out of clay, because most people specialize in these materials. And the clay, if you know anything of like Yoruba tradition and West African like religion, the eyes rattle and they're held as water vessels. So that is an ancestor who is taking ownership, primarily out of their spirituality, right? And yet when you go to South Carolina now, or even when you look at the display at the PMA, there are two versions, the 1800 created by the indigenous African, and then we have one that was created by white people. And they're no longer called a very offensive term. It's just, it's the face vessel. And these are these grotesque heads that we make for some reason. And there's an issue right now because people are trying to give the credit where credit's due to the indigenous Africans, but this is a debate that is happening right now as well. So that is a way in which people make money. That is a way in which people practice their spirituality, that if there are any Afro-descended folks who are in South Carolina, technically are not allowed to take ownership of it. This is their ancestral practice, and this is the reason why we do it, because it's been appropriated for so long. So that's all. It just reminded me of these very things.
That was all for the chat. So if anyone from the audience has a question, right, the IRL audience. Okay.
I want to thank you all for coming and thank our wonderful panelists. And I think we just, touched the surface of, I think, really deep, profound, important, and complicated discussions around representation of cultures in museums and who gets to make the decision. And so thank you all. Keep reading and
Okay, thank you everyone in Zoom. We're leaving you.
Bye. Bye, Peggy.